let's get this thing going. Welcome everybody to the first plenary session of the central part of the Ecclesia Project gathering. Is that what we're calling this year? The live conversation part with John Dyer. I don't know if you are able to imagine yourself in that lovely big room at Technique Towers where it's a little bit stuffy and Whiffenstock is set up in the back of the room with the piles of books, and we've all climbed a lot of stairs, but that's okay. Either way, we are gathered, and boy, it's a joy to see you guys here today. This is going to be a lot of fun. So we're here today with John Dyer. So great to have John here. John's a theologian who was trained at Durham University, and he's the dean and professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, and the maker of, among many other things, an open source video player that's used on a lot of websites nowadays, and what may be very dear to the hearts of many people together here today, the y'all version of the Bible. So this is going to be great. Thank you for being with us, John. Just one note as we get started. As you may have noticed, your chat function is set up so that you can chat to, it says Ecclesia Project, and the nice person labeled in the Ecclesia Project box up there is actually Todd Edmondson. Hi, Todd, who's running tech for us today. So the way this is going to work is that John and I are gonna talk for maybe 40 minutes. We'll see how it goes. We kind of got some ideas. We're not really scripted. We're making it up as we go along. And then we're going to open this up to questions, because we do want everybody who's here to have a chance to get in on the conversation. So what we'd invite you to do is, as you're listening, feel free to use that chat function to write in comments or questions you have. They'll go to Todd, and Todd will be collecting those. And then when we go into question and answer period, Todd is going to make sure that you get a chance to ask your questions. So I hope that sounds clear. You may also want to feel free to use your little reaction button there if you want, while you're listening to us, to applaud or a thumbs up or whatever you want to give us little reactions. Thank you, Shane. See, somebody's already paying attention. Because we are live here, as strange as this is a way that we're being live together, and as much as possible, we want to enjoy the fact that we get to be together today. Okay, I hope that sounds all right to everybody. So John, hi.
Hey.
I want you to know I did this thing. Every tab on my laptop is turned off except for this one.
Okay.
About that, right?
Focus,
so it's all about you, man. Actually, I'm going to turn off self-view too, just so I can be sure that I'm. There we go. Great. Not thinking about my hair. Thank you for this talk. This was, we gave you a really big job, a really important job, to figure out how to start this gathering off by giving a positive account of technology to a community of people who, to be honest, include a lot of people who are not that enthusiastic about technology as we're experiencing it now. And man, I think you really went for it. You gave us the big positive account, like all the way down to the roots, asking us to rethink what we mean by technology in the first place, and to understand it not just as neutral, but as good, without ignoring all the ways that it can go wrong. And always keeping the emphasis, which is great for us, on the goodness of God, right? The goodness of God is always at the center of the story. So I'm really thrilled to have the chance to get to keep talking with you about this.
Yeah, this will be fun. Thank you again for having me. I mean, Gary, who's on here, we connected a couple years back, and it just sounds like such a fantastic gathering. So I would love to be able to make it up there sometime and actually be able to see the actual spot. But this is really special, and it's neat to be able to do something that we couldn't do otherwise. So it's great.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about how you got into this. Like, how did you get interested in writing about technology and Christian faith? Like, was there a moment where you realized you had something you wanted to work out or something you wanted to say about it?
Yeah, I mean that's a good place to start. I mean, I think I'm kind of right on that generational gap between Gen X and millennial, right there. And so I kind of grew up sort of on the internet, but I remember a time before it, and that kind of age. And so I think as I came out of college in the early 2000s and started doing a little bit of web development, really feeling excited about getting to make stuff and how neat this all was. I probably had several experiences that I wouldn't all not all at once that I recognized that I was really interested in going deeper in this, but on the one hand, I was developing things both for insurance websites and just normal stuff, and then also some Christian related things, some Bible products and things, and thinking like, man, I can really harness this neat thing for good. But of course, there was these other things that happened. There was 9/11 and how we all reacted to that and saw that probably on the internet for the first time. And then the social media came online, and the iPhone comes online. And one of the things that if we weren't recording, I would tell you a little bit more about this story. But I had a really close family member be arrested for buying child pornography, and watching that whole process, and how did I view that person and their culpability and the sins done to them and the sins they did to other people and the internet's role in all of those things. And so I felt like I was kind of experiencing the range of the goodness and the most evilness that you get. And so it just kind of made me start to wonder about what was all this, and how did it matter? And so I think that time, early 2000s, you go on the internet and you search for like technology and theology, right? And you don't find much. You find kind of two things. You find what seemed to me to be like a critical rejection of this is all bad and it's going to destroy us, which may be true, right? And then there's this other side of this uncritical embrace of people just saying like, here's how to use it. So, hey, it's here, and we might as well use it. And it was sort of those two things, and beyond kind of vague. Redeem the technology stuff. There just didn't seem to be much depth, at least online. And so then you have to go offline to find that. And so you find, McLuhan and Postman and O'Leal and all those guys, and start really thinking, okay, there's more to it. And that made me reverse to the point of going, well, maybe this is all terrible. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this at all. And trying to find a way through that, where I'm not uncritically embracing it and I'm not critically rejecting it, but maybe I'm critically embracing it in some way. I'm trying to hold those two things in tension and push them as far as I can make them go, so that I can push to the negative all I want, but I can also sort of reclaim the goodness of this thing. So really, the first thing I ever did, I went to a conference called Bible Tech, and it was all Bible developers, mostly white evangelical dudes, right? All, which is pretty much what that world was. And kind of gave a presentation about the Bible as a technology and the different technological shifts that have happened. And in this world, often what you would hear is this phrase: the method might change, but the message stays the same. That's kind of a pretty common thing to hear, at least in probably free church circles, in particular. And I was saying, no, that's not true at all. When you change the method, or you change the medium, in this case, things happen. And I think that was kind of my first start, just really with kind of fellow developers and wanting to think about what it was that we were doing. And that sort of branched out into different areas of, kind of trying to work in the academy and in the church and do a little bit of both. So sorry for the long answer, but that was kind of some of the things that got me going and made me want to try to figure out, how do I bring these wonderful thinkers to everyday programmers, to people in churches. It's happening in academia, but how do I take that to the regular person in the pew?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's a great story that illustrates the ways like this thing operates. New technologies are really operating on us in ways that are very personal and domestic and in the families, and also sort of big economic and social and political trends. And that's part of what makes it, I think, such an important topic for a lot of us to be thinking about, right? That it's working on all those levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I wonder, your talk, it really focuses on technology in a way I found really changes my expectation that it's a new thing and that it's a neutral reality, right? Both of those. And you're doing that by starting your account of technology really from the image of God, thinking about human beings as being made in God's image, God as a creator, and God wants humans to be kind of participating in that,
Mhm.
creating. So I wonder, would you talk to us some more about who this God is? Because I think
Mm.
that's a very compelling part of the way you're thinking about technology. At the heart of this, you really have an account of who God is.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I think that's so important. I think we all, that distance between what we believe about God and what we experience about God, and wanting those to come together in some way. I think we're all, at least that's how I feel like what a lot of my life is. And I think understanding, God as maker has been for me an image of Him that's helpful. And so when I think about this, I as an overall subject, part of what I think I want to do is sort of re-enchant technology as a thing. And what I mean by that is kind of drawing on Max Weber's idea that modernity has sort of, with secularization and technology being part of that, has sort of disenchanted the world to where we rationalize everything and we don't see that spirit behind it. And so retelling, re-looking at the biblical story kind of through a lens of modern technology, and allowing that to then flood our world with sort of a biblical view, and whatever biblical means, right? I know that word is pretty tough to use these days, but whatever that means, some type of God enchanted way of looking at the world. And so, I grew up, probably speaking of just the Genesis 1 and 2 stuff. I grew up in a pretty, more fundamentalist, literalist tradition, where really, if Genesis 1 was not about 24-hour days, if you couldn't trust that, you can't trust the whole thing, And so that was kind of a scary view to have, because you're very much about the fear of losing the rest of the Bible if you explore anything other than that. And so it really wasn't until I studied actually genetics in high school, in college, and basically spent 5 years evolving E. coli and trying to make stuff, and trying to reconcile faith in this. And so it wasn't until I got to study Hebrew, and get to read other ancient Near Eastern accounts of creation, the creation event, that you see they're usually about chaos. They're about the gods are arguing, they're at war, and that's how creation happens. Or that humanity is really kind of an afterthought. There's usually, one god cuts up another god, and out of his guts humanity comes. Or humans are made to be these food bearers for the gods or something like that. And usually when there's a story of evil, it's the god's fault, and the humans are suffering because of the gods. And so, when I look back and I reread Genesis as kind of a critique in that world, you see this God of just absolute beauty and of wonder and of interest. And when I see the flying things fly and the swimming things swim, it just seems like this delight in seeing what's going to be made. And so, I think there's some other things there that we talked a little bit about there. We've all heard the 3 days of separating, the 3 days of filling. And for me, I just kind of go, that's really interesting that God seems to spend some time being a planner and having a clear purpose and direction for the things that God is making. And also it seems to have some type of limits to it too, that this isn't a free for all of unlimited power, although that's what we believe about God, that He seems to then narrow down as things sort of solidify in their purpose and in their direction. And then I think even building in, rest into that process, to say this is ridiculous. Why in the world would God need rest? But I think He's kind of modeling what kinds of creativity He wants to have in there. And so, we often talk about the, Eliel's concept of la technique, this way of thinking. But I think even God is showing this liturgical pattern of making and resting, that there is a technique of God in His design. And so I think lastly, the one I gave, the other just thing I think is so neat in this pandemic era, where we've been hearing a lot about mRNA, and all the stuff I studied in college is so cool that it's actually working now and saving lives, that I think of when I think about creation and sort of time and evolution and all those things. I told my daughter the other day, she was asking about it, and I was like, I think it's kind of like watching Bob Ross. Remember him on PBS, and he paints? And, the end result is neat, but what's so fun is watching him make, And I think that's what evolution gives us, is this ability to watch God make, to see what He set in motion, and to see it grow and learn and fill the universe with all of these neat things. So I think it's fun that we get to see God create. And I think even in the, Psalm 19, we see the two things is the word of God and the creation of God. These are the things through which we meet Him. And I think for different ones of us, we meet him sometimes more one than the other, depending on the different stages of our lives. So I appreciate that the first thing we see about God is that God creates, and the next thing is that God makes us in God's image. And I know there's a lot to say about what God's image means, but I think that co-creative activity is at least part of that.
Hey, can I pause and back you up because you
Sure.
threw out an element there, and I know that this is a thing that some of the folks on the call think about. So the way he talks about technique, right, and the logic of technology, that it has this implicit logic that's just kind of, you try to say we can use it for good, but it has this logic, it's just steamrolling toward kind of its own end, which is just increase power, right, and do whatever is possible, and as soon as it becomes possible it must be done. And it's really interesting to hear you say, look, the biblical account is just that there is a kind of making that's not like that. Is that what I was hearing you say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think when I'm reading Genesis 1, that 26 and 27, we all love that passage. And then you go down and you say, what is it that God was trying to make us do? And I think what was so fun, I think too, is the contrast between, the talk I gave and then Dr. Sarkassis's talk. He's saying, hey, I'm starting in Genesis 4. I'm starting with this assumption that the world stinks, and how do we deal with it? And we're kind of going, even when we look at people, right? And are we starting from looking at people as sinners, or are we starting as them as made in the image of God? Where's going to be our starting point? And I think if we place the starting point here, and we say that when God tells us to multiply and fill the earth and have dominion over it, we can be super literal, and we can say that to fill means to have babies, but I think it's more than that. I think God is asking us to fill with creation as well. And so when he's asking us to cultivate and care for the garden, I don't think that, I think that if a tree is nature, a garden is in some sense culture, right? It's God already starting that direction to it. And so I think he's asking us to do that. And to some extent, we see some of that even before, evil is introduced into the world. So I think if we start from there and we say this idea of filling, like I would probably say, exploring the entire universe would have been part of that original direction. So I think if that becomes an anchor point, that actually gives us a stronger place to critique, to understand some of the nature of technology and its problems, not just in its use, which is important to look at, but also in its very nature, which is what Ayul is talking about. But we can't lose that. We can't cut off the first 2 chapters of the Bible and then just start with evil, right? I think we've got to start with Genesis 1 and 2, and I think that's if I think about theology as tensions, I think whenever we resolve tensions, we often get into problems, right? And this is one of those ones I want to push real hard on, so that anchor point is there before we get into evil and all that stuff.
Wow. So part of what you said there was that having this really strong account of the goodness of technology, and we'll come back to this later, right? But we're understanding technology in a pretty capacious way. This is about human creativity and making and all kinds of tools and activities, and that understanding it fundamentally as good gives you actually the grounds for doing a more thorough critique, not just of uses, but of some things sort of in the way technology works in us, even sort of in its
Yeah. I mean, I think when I'm with a first time, like not you, this audience I know is profoundly reflective, and you think a lot. But a lot of times you're with a group that doesn't do that, and so they're starting usually from this place of really only being able to think about technology in terms of its usage. So am I using it for good, or am I using it for bad? And so, I kind of want to flip the poles on them and say, let's kind of like Heidegger is doing, where he's saying, let's think about the nature of technology. Let's think about that, not just the instances of it. Let's think about its nature. And so in that sense, I would say, its nature is under this umbrella of God's creative powers that he imbues to humanity. And then, but on the flip side, we also want to think about every time we are using a technology in any way, there's always some liturgical transformation that's happening. Whatever we do habitually is going to do something to us. And so that allows us to investigate that route. And so we're thinking, yes, we want to think about the intentionally good and intentionally bad. We want to think about sort of redemptive and sinful uses, but we want to think about whether we're using it for good or for bad. How is it shaping us at the same time? And this is what I kind of mentioned to you in the email,
Yeah.
that normally those are the two halves of a talk, right? And I just gave the first half. And so I so love that our other speakers did such a good job really expanding into those other areas and giving us kind of the balance of that. When I pressed stop on the recording, I thought this feels a little weird not to give this secondary account of how of technology shaping power. But in another way, I think it probably prompts us to really say, do we believe that? Do we really believe, or do we sort of seal off? Does it feel like technology is this other thing? There, like painting, music, those things are cool, right? Those are good techne. But phones and hammers and swords, maybe those are bad techne. And maybe the instances we could talk about particular instances and start to define technology in a more robust way. But I think if we take it up, like you said, up the tree or down into the roots of, we want to make this claim that technology is not some other thing. And I think Neil Postman, for all of the wonders that Postman has and all of his incredible insight into education, he says technology is a result of human hubris and not part of God's original plan. And I don't think Postman is right. I think he's fundamentally wrong about the nature of technology in that area. And so that's what I want to push against. And again, so that it forms an anchor, so that the kind of technological anxiety that we have today, I think it's very difficult for us to separate cultural change from technological change, right? And the older we get, the more resistant we are to cultural change. And so these things start to feel very scary and anxious to us. We kind of take a sort of a conservative position on technology sometimes. And sometimes those positions are right, but we begin to feel this anxiety. But if we can anchor that back to Genesis 1 and 2 and not anchor it in 3 and 4, then I think that gives us an opportunity to do more robust critique as well.
Yeah, we did talk about this in our discussion groups, that we sort of put you in a position by asking you to give a positive account, right?
Yeah.
And then we were all like, wait, there should be more critique. And then we said,
yeah,
actually, we did ask him to do this.
Yeah.
So it's great to have a chance to sort of fill in some of these gaps. Can we, I have so many questions. Can we go ahead, since we kind of started going there, and talk about like how big our use of the word technology is going to be? And I guess the question that came up is there any way, like I have to admit, I totally feel guilty of this, that I call it technology. If it was invented after I was like 10 years old, then it's technology.
Right.
I will totally grant that that's probably true. And that's not good. But then I want to still make some kind of distinctions, right? That there are that when I'm baking bread, or when somebody's repairing the pipes in my house, that's not the same thing as editing jeans, and it's also not quite the same thing as like being on Zoom with each other.
Yeah.
But I have no idea how do I make those distinctions then, once I grant that. It is all human activity. It's all a kind of creativity. It's all about a use of tools. Then is there any way to make some distinctions among those things?
Yeah, that's I think that's a huge question we could spend, a long time on too. And I think, again, Dr. Sarkassis did a good job kind of giving you a couple frames of a couple of definitions there. And then even the way Dr. Schmidt's talking about, mediation as being one of the primary metaphors that we could look at for how technology works. So again, they were both fantastic jobs. And I think some of the simpler definitions of technology tend to be things like tools and methods for practical ends. And so it's focusing us down to these things. But even there, we have both tools and methods, right? Not just artifacts, but also some of the methodology that's around that. And usually this focus on practical ends, but really you start trying to think, so where does that line hit? And is the chalice from which we all drink, is that a tool in some way, or is it something more than that? And so something like Heidegger's question concerning technology, he's going to talk about these 4 different causes, when he's talking about making a chalice and looking at all these different ones. Some of the definitions I've seen that, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, you might need to fill that in a little bit.
Yeah. So it's worth looking up Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology at some point. It's a relatively short, maybe 20-page essay he wrote in the 1950s. Kind of reflecting back over the war era, and like Durkheim and Weber and the early sociologists, like Ellul, like McLuhan, they're all trying to make sense of, it seems like something's different with today's tools. That's kind of what they're all asking.
Right.
And they're all asking it in slightly different eras, right? So McLuhan is really focused on the electronic age, and he studied in a particular way, and his students come and they've all been watching TV, and he's like, they are different than I am. We are fundamentally from different cultures. Heidegger is a little bit more asking more industrial revolution questions about the way that this modern technology sort of, he uses this language of enframing enframing nature, where we look at a cow and we see hamburgers, right? That's what we think of it as being, and it no longer is a being in the world. It's a producer of stuff, and that's one of his primary things. And then I think one of the other thinkers we could draw on would be Albert Borgmann's device paradigm, because this is another way where he's saying, here's a difference between what he would call objects and what he calls modern devices. And this is in the 70s, so this is still pre-internet, but he's recognizing there's some categorical difference that seems like has been happening, whether we put it in the printing press or the industrial age or the electronic age or the TV age or the digital age with internets now. Somewhere in there's been some shifts. And they're all looking at that to some degree. And so I do think there is a difference between maybe what we could, some of the ways we can make distinctions. One would be between just like an artifact, an individual technology, and then sort of the system around it, is one big distinction that we make. And then in kind of the non-physical things would be the social usage around a technology. So that might be, in the US, we drive on the right side. In the UK, you drive on the left side. So there's some kind of non-moral, but just different things that we do. And then, TikTok says videos are vertical now, they're not horizontal. And that brings up a whole new set of things, a whole new social usage. And then the flip side would be the kind of what we talked about, the methods of technology, where IBM was International Business Machines, and now they're a technology company that doesn't make anything physical, right? But they have technical know-how, and that gets closer to what Jacques Ellul is thinking about. I did. I'll stop here, but I did sort of put together like a list of what I think of as some distinctions between ancient tools and modern devices, kind of drawing on Borgmann's idea in the device paradigm, that I think start to give us not really any answers, but maybe some frames that might help us look at the things a little bit differently. And we could walk through some of those if that was a helpful way of thinking about it.
I think so.
Okay. Sure.
Make a judgment call on the fly. I mean, and we'll recognize this is not to be understood as good versus bad.
No, yeah.
So that the same idea that technology is about human creativity can still apply, but we can still distinguish that there are different kinds of things going on. Yeah,
and I think it's very, very hard to distinguish sometimes between is this human pride and greed, or is capitalism itself the bad thing? Which one, and where is the locus of what we're critiquing? And this just kind of talks about this deep tie between technology and culture, and the things that we make and the things that we do they're so deeply tied that it's hard. So I'll give you a couple. Well, first let me do Borgmann's device paradigm. It's just a helpful thing if you haven't got to read it. So he's talking about older, what he calls objects, or what he calls things, and then devices. And he would contrast something like a hearth in the middle of a home where you put wood in it and you light it, and that becomes the heat for the home, versus say central heat, where you press a button and heat comes out. And he's going to say, hey, look, pressing a button, having heat comes out, that saves a lot of lives. That's a good end in some ways. So he's not critiquing the new thing, but he's making a difference in saying there's a couple things about the device that are different, and that one of them is that it sort of turns this product of heat into a commodity that you press a button and it comes out. And then what he uses, where Heidegger uses this term unhiding, he uses this term of hiding a process. So the process of chopping down wood and putting it in there and lighting it, all of those things, it hides that process behind the wall. And so sometimes that chopping of wood can be a human formative thing, which he would call a focal practice. Right. He would also say the way that we are centered around a hearth, that we all sit around it, much in the same way that we sit around a table, that once heat comes out of the ceiling, then we no longer are centered around a particular thing. So he's saying, hey, as we make that shift, how do we then come up with ways in our own life to have centering practices and centering things? And again, a table is a thing that we make, but it does cause us to force us to face one another. I think even right now on Zoom, I'm trying to look at the camera so I don't look down at the screen. Trying to engage in that practice of trying to make us feel like we're together. But okay, I'm gonna give you 10 additional differences just for
Okay,
fun.
wow.
Okay, so one of them I think is that most older tools tend to be physically oriented as opposed to mental, spiritually oriented. And what I mean by that is of course, the language of writing has been around for a long time. That's been largely mental. But I think most of us are either looking at screens or holding a screen most of the day. Very little of our day is spent, with a hammer or something like that, that we're using more tools that are more engaged with our mind and therefore closer to our spirit. I think another one is just that most of our older tools had a single use. I mean, you look at a hammer, you know what it does. You look at a cup measure, you know what it does. Most of our devices today are multi-use. And I think that can create a kind of teleological ambiguity. And what I mean by that is that when you look at a screen, you don't really know what it's for. It's for everything and it's nothing, right? And so we tend to go in whatever direction our sort of synapses fire at that moment, right? So again, this isn't meant to say that multi-purpose is bad, like you said, but just to point out that the single use kind of creates a different set. I think another one is that to use the language of McLuhan, we think about technology extending some part of us. So telescopes extending our eyes and microphones extending our voice. But I think instead of extending, they're typically replacing in some way today. So another way of saying that is a technology of the past, a tool would help me do something, and a device does something for me. So I think like a broom helps me do something and a Roomba does something for me, right? So that's another little way of thinking about it. And another way just about its nature is that older technologies, older tools like an older car is maintainable. And today, most things are just replaceable. So you used to kind of know how to tune a piano, and now you just buy a new keyboard when the old one is out, right? So we replace things and we throw a lot of things out, which destroys our earth, the very earth that God's called us to create. Another one I think would be most older tools tend to be self-contained, in that once they're made, they operate for a long time as long as we do that maintenance with them. But most of our tools since the Industrial Revolution are dependent in some way. They're dependent on fuel, right, for generations, and now they're dependent on an internet connection, even your toaster and your door lock, right? That they're dependent on this larger network, this whole other system of things. And what that does is that means that the tools go from being inert to being persuasive because they're connected to that larger network. Our shovels never try to get us to dig another hole, but our phones sure as heck try to get us to do more things, right? Because there's someone on the other end of that connection that has a vested interest in what you do with that device, right? So that inert to persuasive, and that has to do with its connection. And I think this is the other one is that we move from devices that are part of our presence to now ones that make us from presence to connection. So right now we're all connected, right? We're in real time interacting, but we're not present exactly in the same way that we think about it in terms of being physically present. And this is lovely and wonderful and good, but it is fundamentally different. And so when we change the methods, we do change the message to some degree at the same time. A couple other ones I would say is one is that older tools invite effort and newer devices invite attention. Right. So, I mean, you think about like a piano versus a TV, they both kind of have different things there. And I think, attention can be, again, not a inherently evil thing, but that's what most of our devices are looking for is our attention throughout the day. And I think just speaking to the power too, I would, to use a good little alliteration, would go from kind of linear things to logarithmic things. So we're in that stage where things like AI and the kinds of power that we have are just an enormous. They're so much bigger than they used to be in the past. But another one that I think is just fun to think about, bring it back to creativity, I think is more about like today we're less about creating and more about remixing. And I think we're always to some extent remixing because we're, as Tolkien would say, we're co-creators with God. None of us are, or we're sub-creators with God, that we're always remixing something that he's done. But I think there is that difference between making something from scratch versus remixing. And I think, even today, I just before this, I went and I made a pour over coffee because I didn't want to use the Keurig. So sometimes that step back, I didn't roast the beans this time, but I did take at least one step back, which for me is kind of a bit of a focal practice, a bit of kind of a reset for me that helps me kind of reattach to humanity before I go and become a flat face on Zoom for a little while with some
Right, right.
friends. So I hope those are helpful, fun
Wow,
things.
you could see I was, here, I'll look at the picture. I was taking notes like crazy because that's enormously helpful for
Mm,
kind of revealing those things that we have senses, right? That this is forming us in a way that's different. And I think you just laid it out there in terms
mm,
of the hiding the process, the commodification, the oh, I love this one, right? The persuasive rather than inert,
mm.
the disposable rather than maintain. I mean, this lays out all kinds of things. That's really helpful.
Good, good, good.
So one of the things that really grabbed me in your talk,
Mm.
sorry, I didn't send you this in my notes ahead of time. You can go with it though. I was really grabbed by your attention to all the places in scripture where there's stuff about unjust scales. And
Yeah.
you made the connection that this is uh, uh, the law, the biblical law, talking about
Mm,
systemic injustice,
yeah.
right? And that has a lot to do with our critique, understanding technology is a good, but can be misused, can have all these bad effects, and we really have to pay attention to the systemic effects as well as
Mhm.
the individual effects. So do you have, I know you gave the example about the highways and that kind of
Mm,
thing, but thinking about these newer technologies that we were
mm,
just talking about, do you
yeah.
have some examples of those sort of systemic injustices we should be paying
Yeah.
attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think most the AI field and I think the genetics field are probably the two where this comes out, the most. And I had lunch before this with a friend who works for a medical technology company, and what they're working on is kind of AI systems to look at medical data and try to make predictive analytics about people's risk for particular things that might come up in the future. And so it's really taking a deep dive into data. And so I asked him, I said, hey, I'm going to go talk with this group about, technology ethics. What do you guys do? What do you talk about? How does that come out in conversation? And so I can tell you some more about what he talked about, but I think that would be a big area is just that sort of privacy and how we treat someone humanly in that area. So that really puts the AI field and the medical field together. Another one that I think you hear a lot about with AI is sometimes at the just basic level of facial recognition technology. Depending on if it's made in Silicon Valley, it tends to be really good at recognizing white people, but not darker skinned people. And if it's made in Asia, it's better at recognizing Asian faces than it is about recognizing faces from other areas. So sometimes AI will end up reflecting our own biases, and what we put in, and that can be in the way we construct it, but it can also be unintentional in the way we put data into it. So sometimes it can reveal things about us. So when you run an AI on language, it's going to make these unfortunate connections between, say, I can't remember if I gave this example, but of like the word doctor in males and the word nurse in women. But that's built into the way we've been talking for hundreds of years. So when you feed it everything we've ever read, that's what it comes out with. So I think you can see those, and it's revealing things about us that then we have to go kind of deprogram the AI in order to do that. I think on the more genetic side of things about where we're moving. I mean, you've seen probably in this power of moving from like traditional vaccines to the mRNA style vaccines, where we're sort of deploying directly the DNA rather than deploying something that we react to. You can see that movement toward enacting change in some way. And so if we, enact a change in a person that then is passed on generationally, that next person isn't necessarily consenting to those changes. And so I think there's a whole world of questions that are around all of those kinds of things. And I think in the probably another one would probably be the criminal justice system is a really, really big one. And I've seen some really, really powerfully positive and powerfully negative ones, where sometimes these associations get made where it's looking for someone who's most likely to do this criminal behavior. But because we tend to arrest people of particular races for certain criminals, as for certain things that we don't arrest other people, then the arresting is what's building the bias into the AI and then into who it thinks it's going to have done something. On the other hand, if you were to ask a bunch of judges, how many years to sentence somebody, that can vary wildly based on whether or not they just had lunch or what kind of phone call they got. People are not particularly rational, and as we all know, and kind of the decisions that we make, we're not super rational in them. And so sometimes there are ways in which that kind of technology can help frame and help someone make a better decision that's a more fair and just one. So sometimes there's ways in which the technology can help us to be blind in the right kind of ways instead of the wrong kind of ways, if that makes sense, because none of us want to be colorblind, but at the same time we may want to have structures around the biases that we have. So we're seeing a little bit of all of those things. I think the thing that I would say is that over the last 5 or 6 years, maybe even 10 years, there's been a bunch of like AI principle statements. So they come from like the IEEE, the International Engineering Association. They've done one. There's even a kind of a Southern Baptist AI ethics, list. I think we're past that statements area, and we're probably where we need legal action on these, and so kind of like that Europe passed the GDPR, we're probably at that point where we need to start enacting laws. And as you know, our government's not awesome at that, right? They're not awesome at technical understanding, because, as you know, the internet is a series of tubes that needs to be regulated, right? And so we're at a place, I think, where we need to go past principles into actual, laws about these things. But what those laws need to be is really challenging.
Oh, that's really interesting. And hey, plug for you guys watching the film discussion tonight is going to go right into some of these issues, particularly about facial recognition software and AI. So if you're interested in that, by all means, tune into that film discussion, because I think we'll have a chance to unpack that a lot more. That's a really important part of the story. So I'm watching the time. I want to ask you one more question before we open it up to other people. And that is this: you ended with this really interesting, what I would call a suggestion about a kind of heuristic for making calls about technology. And that is that we ask ourselves, is this something that will belong in the end, right? Is this a technology that would belong in the kingdom of God? Is this a technology that belongs in the New Jerusalem, right? Or is this a technology that, what did you say, optimizes life for the table? So can you give an example? What's a technology that you can imagine in the New Jerusalem?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I come from the land of like super literalists, right? So I don't want to, I mean, we're not talking about grasshoppers and helicopters and that sort of stuff in Revelation. But, every time we look at these portraits of, whether it be the prophets, whether it be Revelation, there does always seem to be this joyous table. There's wine and there's food, and so you're trying to think of like, if you watch Mel Gibson's The Passion, Jesus invented the table, right? So there's going to be a table there, and there's going to be cups and food. So you're trying to think of, Jesus is going to be on a throne, and yet Revelation is telling us that there's no need for the sun because Jesus's light emanates outward, right? So does that mean there's no light bulbs? I mean, I don't know how to take these things, but they do seem to portray a profoundly sort of physicalist world, right? Where it's not a Gnostic vision, right? Yeah. It's something about a material world where a resurrected Jesus, even the resurrected Jesus that we see in the end of the Gospels, he's making fish, right? And so I'm looking at that going, man, so what else, And I think what can be instructive in this as more of a rhetorical question is, when we think about, so what technology do we think won't be there? And so, like I would say, for example, medical technology, vaccines and respirators and stuff like that. And so for me, what that does is that allows that technology today, say a respirator, to be kind of a foretaste of heaven, to remind me of what the echo of the past and looking forward to the future, and saying, man, that gives me a sense of one day God will release us from the need for those types of things. And that doesn't mean that profession is not valuable. In fact, it's showing us something, and it's functioning in a way that I might say is functioning kind of like an icon functions, right? Is it's a pointer toward another age. Then at the same time, when we say something like maybe it sort of feels like screens shouldn't be there, right? It just for some reason it feels like there just shouldn't be those. So maybe that makes me ask this question. So why do I feel so strongly about screens? And what does that say about me today and the kind of life that I'm forming for myself? I don't know if there's gonna be screens or not. I hope there's spaceships, but and those would seem like they would need some type of screen or instrument panel, but I don't know those things. And so I think that this is as an exercise in, when we read the Sermon on the Mount, we say, how do I live today in light of that day? How do I live eschatologically? I think we can ask that question about technology, even if we're not really sure of the answer. It does help us think about, am I using my technology today in an eschatological way that's reflective of the kingdom of God, that he's bringing. The kingdom of God is near, but the one that's coming in the future as well.
Yeah. I think microwaves are maybe garments of skin. Necessary under the conditions of the fall, but not going to make it into the kingdom. But
I like that. Yeah. Yeah. One person answered, I said, so what do you think will be there? And they said, the cloud. And I was like, oh, that's a bad Bible joke, man. That's pretty bad. But I appreciated it. So.
Well, I want to open it up now. Todd, maybe you can help us. Are there some questions out there people have been raising or would like to raise? You guys feel free to use the chat function to let us know some things you'd like to engage with John around.
Sure. Yeah. The way I think maybe the way we'd like to do this is we've had one question come in so far. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and send them to me in chat. And we'd like for you to be able to ask your question if you would like. So I'll spotlight you. I'll allow everybody to unmute yourself now. So if you have the floor, you can feel free to unmute yourself and then ask the question. If you'd rather me ask the question, just let me know that too, and I'll ask it. So our first question comes from Rich. So I'm gonna spotlight him in just a moment if I can find him.
I can talk. Is that?
Oh, there you go, Rich. Yeah, there you
all
are.
right, good. Yeah, first of all, thank you all, Kelly and John, for your efforts and very engaging. One of the things that came up in our group is I guess the tension, or really the debate we had between the purpose of human beings as creators or co-creators, at the very least intention, particularly since you borrowed a lot from Genesis, on our vocation as caretakers. And we had a lot of good discussion about that. And I think, just to use one of your recent examples, when you talked about making the jump from burning firewood for heat to having central and air, which I'll have to admit is very pleasant. But what's underneath that I'm surrounded by coal-fired steam plants, and a lot of other technology is about to use up all the air and the water, and particularly in some areas of the world. So it's not a neutral advancement. And certainly we co-created that. So at what point does the caretaker come in? And how does that fit in with the idea of technology as a good gift from God? So thank you.
Oh, that's a great. Thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, I mean, I think Christians in particular should take really seriously, climate change and our role in that, particularly with technology. And I go back to, the Genesis 2 part where God is giving, the garden is there, and God says that humans are made to care and to guard or to watch over. And so this word for cultivating is kind of a word that usually has some tool usage in mind, right? So we're thinking about making something more. But then the other word there that maybe sometimes is tend to. Can also be used for like someone who's guarding or preserving a tower. So a soldier would do that in front of a kind of a field of war. And so you're thinking, man, if one of our fundamental calls is to preserve, then we want to be really, really careful with that. And so this, again, speaking of these tensions, that right there, just in those very two words, we've got both poles here of making something, but also of guarding it and preserving it at the same time. So I think we're called to do that. Now, how we implement that's really, really hard. Just because just because you don't get straws at Starbucks, you're not doing a ton there. I mean, it does a little bit, but not a ton. So I think thinking deeply about that, about the ways in which we use power and where that power is coming from. I'd love to, for example, I'd love to get an electric vehicle, but I know it's going to just burn somewhere further away from me, and it doesn't make me entirely unculpable for that. So I appreciate, you saying that, and I don't know how you do the balance, and I don't know. Sometimes the answer is just the easy answer is balance, but I do think we see that from the very, very beginning, that this call for being a co-creator and as a caretaker, that those are put just right next to each other at the same time.
All right. Tim Otto has a question. So
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciated you bringing up the whole thing about capitalism and how it interacts. And I just finished the book, The Twittering Machine, and I just found that so daunting, just that, the social industry has kind of made us all producers for these companies, where we might think we're trying to promote something good in the world, or we're just showing grandma these pictures we took, but in fact, we're creating more space for ads, and so we're being exploited and we're being sold. Our attention is being sold. And so it just makes me end up feeling like we really are in the matrix, and it just feels so daunting. But anyway, that's actually not my question. The question that I have is, I feel like we in response to all of this, we tend to go in either individualist or nation state directions. Like, I can get an app on my phone to help me use Twitter less or whatever, so that's an individualist solution. Or, the legislature needs to make these rules to make tech companies behave. But, we're the Ecclesia Project. And so I guess practically, what do you see as the role for the church? Like, I mean, I know that a lot of you provided a lot of the theological basis, and so I don't mean to overlook that. But I guess practically at a local body level, what do you imagine the church's role to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think of these sort of four layers of the ways that we can be interacting. So as you mentioned, the individual level, we need to make choices about the kind of person we want to become and the kind of liturgies that it takes to get us there. So like you said, you put an app on your phone, or you put your running shoes out by your bed, so when you wake up it's easier to do that, and you don't buy the ice cream, right? So it's harder to do that. So there's that individual level, and then you mentioned the legal nation state level. I think the other two that I would say, like you said, is the church functioning as a healthy community? So rather than the individual level, that the church just chooses as a community. So, and I mean that at both levels of, the local congregation, the parish, however that works for you in your context. And then the church as a whole, hopefully functioning as an alternative world. There's always that sort of city of God, city of man thing going on at the same time. And that we don't confuse that with the nation state, right? Which is what's happening a lot in our country today. And then I think the fourth level is the role of the creator, right? The role of the person who is a maker to go into the space and to be one of the people who is operating in this. So the friend that I was telling you about earlier, who's operating this medical AI space, coming in and making sure that there's a view there at the table that is looking at humanity as having inherent dignity and worth, and not just as a product. And so, my friend was kind of sort of walking through the legal obligations they have, but also sort of their own ethical guidelines for how do we humanize, how do we treat the human more importantly than we treat the companies that we're interacting with. So again, I think that's why I so deeply care about the role of the creator, that they don't see themselves as just this isn't just a money-making thing or an evangelizing thing, that the actual making of it itself is worshipful to God, and also can be kind of a redemptive thing that says there's always going to be systems out there, right? We can't desystematize everything, but we can try to design systems that are more for human flourishing and less for systemic oppression. Incidentally, if you search for the word, you put in quotes, systemic evil into Google, there's only one result. It's really, really weird, isn't it? I mean, there's systematic, there's other forms of that. If you air quote systemic evil, there's just one. It's really, really, I mean, not air quote, you actually quote, there's only one there. And I just found that fascinating, that level of analysis just isn't as prevalent as you would really want it to be. So thanks for the question. And I think going back, the one thing I would encourage you on about sort of the attention economy and all that sort of stuff, I think you use this phrase of we feel like we're being enslaved. And I think, without being too Pollyanna-ish, when I think about like Jeremiah's call to his people of saying, we're being colonized in some way by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and before that, the Egyptians, that there is this call to make houses and gardens and babies and seek the flourishing of the city, that having sort of an oppressive group on us isn't a super new thing for different levels of humans. Maybe it's a little bit new for those of us who have experienced a certain degree of privilege in our lives, but that role of being having something out there and still living a life of faithfulness that has a eschatological view of hope, I think is still possible to do today. But they are different oppressors today that we have to deal with.
That's all the questions that have come in so far. So we'll sort of encourage anyone who has a question to send it in, and we can relay it.
Oh, I think some of you are probably wondering something. The answer is yes. My books are in fact color coded on my shelf here, so that's how I have them arranged. In case you've been wondering, I just wanted you to answer that question.
That's an important one.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, we have a question for Mark from Mark Ryan. So I'm gonna spotlight him and take it away, Mark.
Can I make a suggestion? Actually, I should have done this earlier. When you ask your question, you want to maybe tell John something about who you are and where you are.
Oh yeah, that'd be nice.
So yes, he has some idea who he's talking to. Yeah.
Am I on mute? I'm unmuted, I think.
No, you're good.
So my name is Mark Ryan, and I teach Christian ethics. I'm at the University of Dayton, which is a Catholic Marianist college in Southeast Ohio. What's coming to mind for me? This is something that I think that you've touched on to some degree. Is something that a term that Pope Francis coins in the encyclical Laudato Si, called the technocratic paradigm. And I've puzzled about what that concept is at times, but one thing it seems to do is to sort of move the attention away from artifacts and maybe towards what you talked about as the whole ethos and the formative elements. And I think that one of the strong reasons for using that term in the encyclical is that it suggests that technology is something that we become, or technology in that broader sense is something we become dependent upon, to the point that we sort of don't know where else to go. We don't know how to live without it. And when I think about this in the context of my own life, and part of which is parenting children, it seems to me that technology has made us stupider in some respect, and particularly I mean that it can kind of crowd out the places that where practical wisdom would be cultivated, and at the institutional level, we see this one paradigm kind of sticking its foot in so many doors, It comes in the university through kind of this emphasis on goals-based learning, assessment, and so forth. And I think one of the modes of maybe kind of critique, way of life that is alternative has to be somehow protecting those again those practices that simply are different, simply don't survive a kind of reduction to what Pope Francis calls a technocratic paradigm. I guess throw that out. I'm not good at asking questions, but I hope you can find something to respond to there.
No, thanks, Mark. And I'd love to know if you have any sort of what books do you use with your students to teach technology ethics? What do you find to be most helpful that they respond to, I suppose? Sorry, I'm flipping out the question, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, you may have heard hints of that. Part of what I do and I teach business students who aren't, so it's not directly technology, but I try to teach them about places where we can cultivate wisdom, activities that can be understood as places where virtues can be cultivated. So a lot of it derives from Alistair McIntyre's old book on this.
Yeah.
So that's one important source for me. But I often find that what I'm kind of fighting against is the not only concealment in terms of our everyday life with the devices, but concealment in terms of, for example, for me, right, the idea that economics is completely objective about what human rationality is and what human desires are. That kind of reductivism.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of, there's so many directions we could go in there. And I think I appreciate the way Francis framed that, because he's like JP2 is largely, I think, embracing of technology in a way, but also providing helpful critiques at the same time, and not focusing on just individual devices, but like you said, more of the system part, but also kind of the way of life, right? And what type of life do we have, and do we just sort of take what we're given, or do we actually try to structure it in some way? And I think there's always that analogy, for example, of food, that most of human society was about getting just enough food to survive, and now that we have a superabundance of it, we now have to decide what we're going to consume, and we now have infinite transportation, so now we have to exercise in order to keep our bodies going in a certain way. And I think we're kind of at that stage with our minds, right? We have to decide how do we want to exercise our minds and our souls in a way that is forming us in a particular direction. Now there's some interesting parts that I find I'm not really sure what to think about. So I know I react to my own kids now. They're in 5th and 7th grade, to the way that they react. And my wife and I had left for a little bit and told the kids, hey, no internet while we're gone. And when we came back, I was like, hey, what'd you do? And I said, well, and my son said, hey, I chatted with my friend online. I was like, what? I thought I said no internet. And he's like, that's not the internet. And so just our whole understanding of what we're talking about with these things, and what's normal to him and what I grew up with they're just different. And so there is that cultural divide that sometimes makes me judge something in a way that I didn't expect. And I saw, you guys all remember that, I don't know if it was Stanford or where it was, but the marshmallow test with kids from like the 1950s, like you put a marshmallow in front of a kid and you see how long they can last before they eat it. And can they delay gratification? And believe it or not, over the last like 50 years, kids, the time that they can wait has gone up. And you're like, I would have thought for sure with, the way my kids watch Netflix and the way I watched TV growing up, I would have thought for sure there's absolutely no way, but that's gone the other way. And I also had this reaction reading Sherry Turkle's book, Reclaiming Conversation, about how, empathy scores have gone down over the last, say, 40 years, but that when you effectively turn off your phone and pet a horse for a weekend, that your empathy score goes way back up, right? And I thought, but did people in the 1970s really have much empathy for people who didn't look like them? Did they really? And so I think about Twitter as this horrible place where I've seen so many different kinds of people that I don't always get to see in my daily life. That I think, well, that I know I don't want to reduce everything just down to like good and bad uses, right? Again, but I'm wondering about these formative effects and which direction they go in, and kind of our because almost every time when we want to go back technologically, we get to super racist places, right? And you're like, so how good was that society if we really want to go back to the 50s? So like all of you, I love Wendell Berry's stuff. I mean, he just what he talks about with nature and beauty and those things, I think that's so great. But I also feel like he wants his childhood back, right? He wants that tractor. He doesn't want the tractor from like 1850s. He doesn't want a heavy plow from the 1700s or from the 700s. He wants a tractor when he was a kid, right? And that's a very shallow critique of Berry. What I want to do is have us self-critique of what things are sort of better, and then what I want to do is critique the whole question of betterness and progress, right? Because there are several really important books about the idea of progress and how that's an essentially technique idea, that there's a movement of society, and that originally comes from sort of Christian eschatology, and this idea that we are moving towards something, toward an end, but that it gets appropriated by sort of the initially modernity and industrial revolution, and then now almost explicitly by Elon Musk and those guys about how we're going to escape and transcend our own bodies. And so I'm trying to think like, what does progress mean, and what does going back mean in some other kind of way, and just really press it. So Mark, I don't have an answer for what you're asking, but I appreciate you pushing that and going, okay, we go back to Pascal. Pascal's saying that all of our problems come from not being able to sit alone in a room quietly, because if we did that, we would freak out. And I think we have more ways to distract ourselves today, but it is a problem that we have been dealing with for a time. And so it's like, there are sort of new problems, but I also think there's just old problems that are being hit at in a new way. And I think we want to hold both those things again in tension and work on both of them. So sorry, that's a long way of answering. Thanks for bringing that up. That's so insightful and helpful.
We have time for 2 more questions. We've got two on deck. We have time for 2? All right. So the first one comes from Erin. So I'll go ahead and spotlight her.
Hey, John, thank you so much. So I almost wrote something about progress and belief in progress as my question, how that plays in. I teach at Fuller Seminary. I teach mostly ethics, theological ethics. I'm curious about why the Industrial Revolution particularly is this point in time that is remarkably shifting at, I would argue, actually a whole bunch of levels. I teach sexuality and I teach medical ethics. And if you look at kind of how sex actually changes dramatically, marriage, gender identity, all of that, feminism, I mean, some good things that I would argue come out of that shift. But it's a time that marks, I guess my question to you is, as you think about that, what is it about that time, that particular shift in human history in the West in particular, that creates these distinctions that you just identified when you talked about devices versus, so what is that, do you think?
Yeah.
Because we're quite against it, right? It seems like there may be a clue in there of discernment, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what's happening there in the Industrial Revolution, wherever we kind of put that, mid 1700s, it's building on so many things that have been happening for a long time, and kind of exploding those things outward. Two books I might just recommend if you're interested in those things. David Hopper's book is Technology, Theology, and the Idea of Progress, and so he's sort of tracing this idea that progress comes sort of from the development of the Christian mind over the first 1,000 years, and then starts to shift in the university movement more in the direction of technology to where you get Francis Bacon saying like, God's going to solve the spiritual side and we're going to solve the physical side with technology. And so these are all making way for when the Industrial Revolution comes along. And then David Noble's The Religion of Technology is really similar. So both Davids, David Hopper and David Noble, both are tracing, sort of similar themes in there. And so, I think too, before that, you also have, the idea of capitalism, maybe 1200s, that's starting to say that, it's saying that all of our sort of sustenance comes from the ground. And so we are attached to the ground. But once you have capitalism as a method for both a hope for the future in a good sense, but also that you can make capital not from the ground, then you're disconnected from the earth, right? And then you can go colonize everyone, right? On the bad side. So that's what's happening. And I think possibly with those kinds of things underneath the hood, and you have sort of the scholasticism movement of Aquinas and all those people starting to elevate for the first time that technology and sort of mechanical philosophy is as important to them as other practical and theological philosophies. You're just seeing this constant elevation of technology, from Plato saying it's bad, get rid of it, to Augustine saying it's okay, right? To Hugh of St. Victor saying like, yeah, this is at that level that we actually want to pay attention to, so that when you get to something like the Industrial Revolution, where all of a sudden you move from animal power to steam or gas or electricity, I think that's the big shift, is that your power is like capitalism, is no longer derived from the earth, that once your power is no longer derived from a life, then all of a sudden everything shifts, right? Arguably, like the Romans had, they had water mills, but they didn't use them because they had slaves. And so it's not until you get Benedictine monks that are like, oh, this is awesome, this will make our manual labor better. And I do think to some extent that once we have power that we don't need bodies for, that makes it possible to not need slavery in our society as much, right? I think we obviously should have done that a long time before, but I think that's the big shift is, sorry, I give a long answer. My answer would be just that shift in power, of where power comes from. That becomes the primary, difference. And then I think today, one of the big shifts that we all saw is that physical presence is not needed for anything anymore, right? In any way. And so we always kind of say like, yeah, the internet's so weird. What if we all lived our lives online? And then we did for a whole year, and we saw what it was like to actually do that. That's probably the biggest shift, is that we don't need to, even though this is lovely and it's wonderful as I stare at a camera and a light, right? That this is neat, but we don't have that same kind of presence. And that to me is one of the big shifts. So thanks for asking that. Do you feel like that's a fair enough answer? The power shift?
All right. So Evan, I'll hand it off to you for, I guess, what will be our final question of the day.
Okay, I'll try not to disappoint on the last question. My name's Evan. I'm a Catholic priest, actually, just in a parish outside of Annapolis. So very grateful for your talk. I feel like you running through those 10 points of the old and new was kind of worth the price of admission to me. So much really great stuff, to questions I can go and think about on my own time and will ask you. So maybe I'll ask maybe a bit of kind of a practical, maybe missiological kind of question, returning to that theme of justice and maybe some of the unconscious ways that technology has impacted our lives. And one of the things that we've seen, especially in this COVID year, when everything's kind of been going online, is the way that there can be very unequal access to technology, and technology is extremely expensive. It costs a lot, like in the area where I live, which is quite affluent, every kid has their, one-to-one iPad program, where 30 minutes up the road in Baltimore, they hardly even have functional Wi-Fi access in places. And I'm just kind of wondering, how as the church we can kind of respond, what difference that makes for our mission, ways that we should be engaged in. I even think about, some of our younger church members and the older ones who, don't even know how to use a dumb phone still. I know that they're kind of aging out to some of our congregations, but so it doesn't, become a church that's too, catering to just the young or those who have access to technology, whether it's at the local church level or the way, that functions globally as well. And so so technology and the way we use it doesn't become just another, more modern kind of colonizing, trend where we're kind of colonizing people because of, their access to technology. And maybe just a couple of your practical reflections on ways that you think, like a local pastor could use technology, what we can kind of learn about technology, areas we could maybe use it more that we're not aware of, areas that we can probably filter it out a little bit. Sorry for multiple questions. I just want to answer one.
That's great. Thank you for being, aware of the needs of your city. And I mean, it almost sounds kind of joking, but when Jesus says, when you visited me in prison and when you fed me, there's almost a sense of like when you provided Wi-Fi for me, right? That is a reality for people today and what they need. And so I think just being aware of your parish's needs and trying to meet those, I think is one of the big ones. So I think there's that local area need reaching, and I think our own church has tried to provide a lot of big open space for the community and for it's big Wi-Fi, but also kids play space so that the community can come in. And so we end up having a fair number of people, I think, that here in Texas where it's really, really hot, that a big air-conditioned place ends up being one of the most helpful ones. At the same time, my wife's work, she's been a professor for a long time as a literature and philosophy professor. And so she's decided to enter into the public school system and work toward a more kind of a classical education model that is meaning a model that sometimes people would say low tech, but I would say like a one that chooses not to use screens as the primary method of instruction. And so that it is something that's able to provide somewhat more of an equitable form of education. So I think there's a variety of sectors that one could be operating in. And then I think there's a number of different, organizations that are trying to work in these fields and attempting to just look for issues of justice that need to happen. And I think that there's some freedom for us in knowing that as much as we want to think through the unintended consequences of our technology, we really should. There's also freedom in knowing that we can't know everything, and we're not omnipotent or omniscient to know all of those things. But I do think that one of the things that I think of on the pastoral side that you mentioned of being willing to experiment and evaluate in community, I think is a really important practice, because the critique part is really, really helpful. But there's some types of technological knowledge that I think are kind of a tacit knowledge that you have to experience to understand to some extent. And so, even taking a kid aside and saying, hey, show me this thing can be a relational connection point, and also a point that helps you be aware of. And I think, it may be appropriate to address technology in a homily here and there, but I think rather than it being like the technology day, usually there's like I'll get invited to do like a parenting technology thing, and it's the one event. And I think rather, since that's sort of the all pervasive reality for us, I think of how often Jesus mentions money as this thing that is not neutral in any way, that whether you have it or you don't, it gives you a different set of questions. I think technology is kind of that thing today, that is so pervasive that it influences, the way that we give and the way that we worshiped in the last year in some way, the way that we connect, all of those things. And so I think rather than doing one day on a technology talk, just having that be a regular part of the things that a pastor addresses. And I think asking people in your congregation what they do and drawing on their expertise can be a really helpful thing. And I think for me, one of the things, this is kind of a left field thing I've just been thinking a lot about, is just the function of kind of idols and icons in my life, the things that are explicit icons, right, that we normally talk about, that these are things that point us toward Jesus. But I also think about like respirators as doing those same things. And then I think of how Twitter can be this thing that can be, or my phone can be this thing that can function as an idol, but I think has the capacity to function as an icon as well, depending on the way in which I'm orienting myself toward that. And so I think giving your people those skills of analyzing the liturgy of their lives and what direction they tend to be facing is something that I think is a really important role within, as a priest or as a pastor, to be helping people see all of it. And I think most of us tend to look at, we tend to focus on the newer technology, and we tend, not to question our cars or our lights or our air conditioner. None of us fast from our refrigerators or our dishwashers, but we do that from our screens. And so I think helping people to analyze the whole pace of their life, and are the couches all arranged toward the television, or what's the focal thing in your family life, or in your home, or in your in your church or in your space. I think asking those types of questions and having technology fit underneath that overall umbrella of the liturgy of our lives could be a really helpful place to walk through with people. So I hope those are a couple of neat things, Evan, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I mean, that being on the ground with people is the way.
Well, wow, John, this has been so helpful, and I think a really great start to this time we're going to have together focusing on these questions. I really appreciate the way you bring experience and expertise about these questions of technology, but you keep putting them into this liturgical framework, right? The end is always what is in fact helping us to worship God better. And so we're very happy to welcome you into the family. Be part of us sometime, and we'd love to have you back. And I hope you'll be around for the rest of this gathering too. So you all who are on the call, I would love to invite you now. Some way we can't give John a round of applause, but if you want to use your reaction button, or if you want to just shake your hands in the air or whatever, give us some sort of visual round of applause. Thank you. That's great. Yeah. Lovely. So I hope you can all join us again this time tomorrow, where we'll be talking with Michael Sakasas more about these questions and carrying on the conversation. Keep in mind that there's the movie discussion tonight as well, and Lectio tomorrow morning, tomorrow noon, depending where you are. And in the meantime, go with God, my friends. Find ways to worship in whatever you're doing, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Cheers and blessings.